First,
Are
Walter
you
Crane.
ready?
He's
As ready
73,
as I'll ever
standing
be.
in a stone chamber underground.
Let's see
A
what's left.
flashlight in his trembling hand, the beam catching the edge of a canvas so vivid it seemed to generate its own light after decades in the dark.
It's so
His
warm
hand
by the
shakes,
fire.
not from
Just
fear,
like our first
from
winter
something
here.
that has no name
I
yet.
love it.
Second, Walter Crane, the same
Steady
afternoon,
now. Let's see
standing
what
at
we've
the
got.
front door of a log
Be
cabin,
careful, the light is
watching
flickering.
3 vehicles pull into the clearing below.
Are you ready to see it?
The woman
Yes,
stepping out of
let's
the
see what we've
BMW
uncovered.
is wearing a
Look at
navy
that
blazer
necklace,
that
it's
probably cost
beautiful.
more than
It
his
is.
last 3 paychecks combined. He taught her to ride a bicycle when she was 6 years old. He remembers the sound she made when she finally stopped falling. His voice quiet and certain. I didn't know which of those 2 things would change my life more. As it turned out, they were the same thing. Cut back 16 months earlier. Walter Crane had spent 34 years fixing aircraft engines at a maintenance facility outside Columbus, Ohio. Not an engineer, a mechanic. The distinction mattered to him in ways he never fully explained to anyone, including Eleanor, though she understood it without needing the explanation. Engineers design things on paper. Mechanics made those things work in the real world with real hands in real time when something was failing at 30,000 feet and the margin for error was exactly 0. He knew a Pratt & Whitney engine the way some men know the sound of their own heartbeat. He could hear the difference between a compressor that needed attention and one that was about to fail. He could feel through a wrench whether a bolt was properly seated or merely pretending to be. After 3 decades, the knowledge lived in his hands more than in his head, and his hands were the thing he was most proud of in a life that had given him many things to be proud of. The stroke happened on a Tuesday in March, 3 years before the letter arrived. The doctors called it mild. Insufficient blood flow to a small region of the left hemisphere, nothing catastrophic. Full cognitive function preserved excellent prognosis for recovery. Walter sat in the hospital bed and listened to the neurologist speak and understood every word. What he did not say to the doctor or to Eleanor sitting in the chair beside him gripping his unaffected hand was that he had already tested the other hand by trying to grip the bed rail and the grip was wrong. Not absent, wrong. A tremor where there had never been a tremor. A lag between intention and execution that had not existed the day before. 3 weeks after he came home on a Thursday afternoon when Eleanor was working her shift at the grocery store, Walter walked out to the garage. He stood at his workbench for a long moment, just looking at the tools arranged on the pegboard the way he had arranged them for 20 years. Then he picked up a simple ratchet and tried to turn a bolt on the engine block he kept on the bench for practice the way some men keep a chess set. It took 4 minutes. The tremor made the socket slip twice. His concentration, which had never required effort before, now had to be consciously summoned and held like water cupped in palms. When he finally got the bolt seated, he sat down on the garage floor and did not get up for a long time. Not because his legs were weak, because he did not know who he was if he could not do this. Eleanor found him there when she came home. She was still in her green Save Mart vest. She looked at him sitting on the concrete floor with the ratchet in his lap, and she did not say anything about calling the doctor or taking it easy or any of the things a person might reasonably say. She just sat down beside him on the cold concrete floor in her work vest, and they sat there together until the light through the garage window changed from afternoon gold to early evening gray. That was the language of 52 years. Eleanor Crane had worked as a nursing aide at Columbus General for 37 years, and the most important skill she had developed in those years was not medical. It was the ability to read what people were not saying. She could tell when a patient was concealing pain. She could tell when a family member visiting the hospital was there out of love and when they were there out of obligation, and she had learned early that the difference between those 2 things was almost always visible in small gestures that people believed no one was watching. She had brought this skill home with her every evening for 37 years, and she had on at least 4 occasions she could clearly remember observed something in one of her children's faces or voices or postures that made her nursing aide instincts go quiet and alert. Each time she had made the same choice. She had decided not to trust what she was seeing because they were her children, because she did not want to be right. The first time it mattered was Thanksgiving dinner, 4 months before they sold the house. Diane was passing the sweet potatoes and asking Walter in what sounded like idle curiosity about the structure of his retirement accounts. Which funds what balance, whether the accounts were jointly held. Eleanor was across the table and she heard the question and something in her chest went very still. This was not idle curiosity. The timing was too precise. the sequence of questions too logical. Diane was gathering information. Eleanor recognized the pattern because she had seen it in hospitals, in families gathered around bedsides making calculations they would be ashamed to name aloud. She said nothing. She passed the rolls. She told herself she was being uncharitable, that her daughter was simply being practical, that this was what responsible adults did when their parents were getting older. She chose not to trust what she was seeing. That was the first mistake. It would not be the last. The selling of the house was framed as a family decision arrived at collectively in everyone's best interest. Diane presented it at a dinner to which all 4 children had been invited, a dinner Walter and Eleanor attended, without knowing it had been organized in advance. The tray of documents on the table was the first sign. The way Brett and Owen were already seated when they arrived, the way no one seemed surprised to see the tray, the way the conversation moved with the efficiency of something rehearsed. Walter looked at the tray and then looked around the table at his 4 children and said quietly, "This looks like a meeting that happened before we got here." Diane smiled. "We're just being organized, Dad." Walter said he was not selling the house. Brett said he was not being realistic. Walter looked at his son, the one he had taught to change brake pads on a 1987 Chevy pickup. When the boy was 14 years old, the one he had told on that afternoon in the driveway that you never use the wrong tool for the wrong job because that was how people got hurt. You're using the right logic to reach the wrong conclusion. I can see that. The room went quiet. Walter looked around it. 4 children, 8 eyes, and not one pair of them meeting his directly. Owen was looking at the table. They sold the house. $137,000. Walter kept a small notebook in the drawer of his nightstand. Not a diary, just numbers. It was the kind of record-keeping a mechanic did without thinking about it. The habit of a man who had spent his working life knowing that the difference between a successful repair and a catastrophic failure was often a single number that someone had failed to write down. Month 1, Diane, $28,000 mortgage arrears, she said. Her husband had lost his position at the commercial real estate firm 3 months ago, and things were very tight, and she was so sorry to ask, but she didn't know where else to turn. Walter transferred the money the same day she called. In the notebook in his careful mechanical handwriting, remaining $109,000. Month 4, Brett, $5,000. Bail, AD. He said a stupid mistake. It would never happen again. He would pay it back within the month. Walter stood in the dark kitchen holding the phone while Eleanor slept, and he knew his son was not telling him the full truth about the circumstances, but he transferred the money anyway because Brett was his son and he was in trouble, and that was what fathers did. Remaining $104,000. Month 6, Carol, $8,000. A surgery her insurance had declined to cover something involving her spine. She had been in pain for months, and finally the doctor said it could not wait. This one Walter did not question at all. Carol had never in her adult life asked for money. She was the one who always said she was fine. If she was asking, something was genuinely wrong. Remaining $96,000. Month 8, Owen, $20,000. Startup capital for a technology services business he had been developing for 2 years. Something involving logistics, software for small manufacturers. He had a real business plan and a real client who had expressed serious interest, and $20,000 would let him hire his first employee and get the thing properly launched. He would pay it back in 6 months. Walter wrote the number in the notebook and then drew a line under it 3 times, pressing hard enough to indent the page beneath. Not from anger, to make sure he did not forget. Remaining $76,000. What Walter did not know, until the night it became impossible not to know, was that the notebook had a gap in it. He discovered it on a Sunday afternoon in October, sitting at the kitchen table in the apartment above the Golden Dragon restaurant on Elmhurst Avenue, with the notebook open and the bank statement spread out in front of him. He was reconciling the numbers as he had done every month for 20 years, and there was a discrepancy. $12,000 drawn on a date in September, a date when he had been at the doctor's office for a follow-up appointment that had taken most of the afternoon. He looked at the date. He looked at the amount. He closed the notebook. He did not ask Eleanor about it that evening, or the following morning, or at any point during the 3 days he spent thinking about it. He waited. And on the 4th day, Eleanor came home from her shift at Save Mart and found him sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook open to the page where the line was drawn under Owen's entry and the bank statement beside it, and she stopped in the doorway in her green vest and looked at him. "You know," she said. It was not a question. "I know." She sat down across from him. Outside the restaurant below, was beginning its dinner service, and the sounds came up through the floorboards, the clatter of walks and the sharp hiss of oil. "He called while you were at the doctor," Eleanor said. "He said the client was ready to sign, but he needed the money immediately or the deal would fall apart." "I knew you would say no." "I would have said no." "I know, because it was the last of what we had." "I know that too." She looked at her hands on the table. "I did it anyway." Walter looked at the line he had drawn under Owen's name. He looked at it for a long time. Then he slid the notebook across the table toward Eleanor, open to that page. "Then we both know," he said. That was all. No accusation, no raised voice, just the quiet acknowledgement of two people who had made different decisions in the same impossible situation, and were going to have to live with both of them together. It was in its way the most honest conversation they had managed in months. Diane's call came 2 weeks later. Her voice had shed the warmth it had been performing for the past year and a half and was now simply efficient. They could not continue to support her parents. They needed to find their own housing. She said it the way a property manager says a lease has expired. Walter was in the kitchen when Eleanor took the call, standing near the window, and he heard every word through the thin walls of the room that smelled of someone else's cooking. He watched Eleanor's face while she listened. He watched the small, careful way she controlled her expression, the same way she had controlled it for 37 years of hospital corridors. When Eleanor put the phone down, Walter did not go to her immediately. He stood where he was for a moment. Then he said, "She'd made that call before she made it. She wrote it out." Eleanor nodded. "Diane plans things." "Yes." They moved into the room on Elmhurst Avenue the following week. $680 a month, second floor, one window that faced the alley walls that smelled of fry oil. No matter how many times Eleanor scrubbed them, the shower pressure was barely enough to rinse shampoo from her hair. The heat worked sporadically. Walter sat on the edge of the bed on the first night, looking out the window at the neon sign of the Golden Dragon, blinking red against the dark alley, and he thought for no reason he could immediately explain about Silas Aldrich. He had met Silas exactly twice. Once at his mother's funeral in 1991, where Silas had stood in the back row without speaking to anyone, had placed white chrysanthemums on the casket, and had left before the service concluded. Once at a family reunion in Oregon in 1987, where Silas had sat in a chair at the edge of the yard drinking iced tea, watching the gathering with the careful attention of a man who observed more than he participated. Walter had not thought of Silas in years, but sitting in the Elmhurst Avenue room with the neon blinking outside, he thought of the way Silas had looked at that reunion, quiet and contained in his chair at the edge of things, and he thought that at the time he had read that stillness as loneliness or eccentricity. He was no longer sure that was right. The social services office on East Broad Street had plastic chairs that had survived the previous decade through sheer institutional stubbornness. Walter and Eleanor had been there 3 times in 2 months. The waiting room was always the same, the fluorescent hum, the numbered tickets, the population of people who were there because the options that required you not to be there had already been exhausted. Their caseworker was named Tiffany Wells. She had kind eyes and a name tag that always sat slightly crooked on her lanyard, and she asked the same questions with the same careful patience every time they came in, because her job required her to, and because she was genuinely trying to help in a system that had more people in it than it had capacity. The housing assistance wait list, she told them on the 3rd visit, was still running 6 to 8 months. She was sorry. She handed them a pamphlet about food bank locations and a list of emergency heating assistance programs. They thanked her and left. On the street outside, the October sky pressed down low and heavy, the color of old concrete. They walked to the bus stop without talking. Walter carried the pamphlet folded in his jacket pocket. When they reached the building on Elmhurst, there was an envelope affixed to the door with a strip of tape. Cream-colored paper heavy stock addressed in handwriting that used a fountain pen in cursive letter forms that no one had been taught in school for 40 years. Walter and Eleanor Crane. Eleanor stood looking at it for almost 30 seconds. In her mind, she was already cataloging the possibilities: a bill from a collection agency, a notice from the building owner, something else that required action they could not afford to take. She had received enough bad news in envelopes to have developed a specific reluctance to open them. Walter reached out and took it from the door. He had decided sometime in the past month, without particularly noticing the decision, that he was done being afraid of bad news. He had received enough of it that the fear had worn through to something on the other side of fear, something steadier and less reactive. He opened the envelope in the hallway. Read it standing under the ceiling light with the cracked plastic cover. Then he handed it to Eleanor. The letterhead read Whitmore and Associates Attorneys at Law Billings, Montana. The letter informed them that they were the sole named beneficiaries in the estate of Silas James Aldrich, deceased age 89, their late cousin. The estate consisted of a log cabin structure on 43 acres of forested land in Jefferson County, Montana. No outstanding debts, no liens, no mortgages. Free and clear. A travel fund of $1,500 had been set aside specifically to allow them to visit the property before making any decisions. Eleanor read it twice. Then she said, Silas Aldrich. Yes. We barely knew him. No. Why would he leave us anything? Walter thought about the man sitting at the edge of the yard in 1987 watching the gathering. I don't know yet, he said, but I want to find out. They called the number on the letterhead that evening after dinner, which was ramen noodles stretched with frozen vegetables and crackers from the discount bin at Save Mart. Harold Whitmore answered on the second ring, a warm, deliberate voice, the voice of a man in his 70s who had spent decades choosing his words carefully. He told them the cabin was remote, no utility lines, a well with a hand pump that still functioned, solar panels installed about 10 years ago, a root cellar. The land itself was not particularly valuable by Montana real estate standards, he said, because it was too far from any town to be developed and too steep for most purposes. But it was theirs, completely theirs, and Silas had prepaid the property taxes through a trust arrangement that would cover the next 50 years. Walter asked him when had Silas set up the trust. Whitmore paused, just a fraction of a second, but long enough for Walter to notice. He first discussed this arrangement with me in 1987, Whitmore said, after a family gathering he attended in Oregon. Walter was quiet for a moment. He decided then, Eleanor said. He was very particular about his intentions, Whitmore said. He wanted you to see the property before making any decisions about it. He felt strongly about that. After they hung up, Walter sat at the kitchen table and did not speak for a long time. Eleanor waited because she knew what he was doing. He was working through something the way a mechanic worked through a diagnostic, methodically, not rushing to a conclusion before he had examined all the components. Finally, he said, he decided in 1987 at that reunion, something he saw that day. We were there the whole time. He was watching. The whole time he was watching. Eleanor thought about it. She thought about what that afternoon had looked like from the outside from a quiet chair at the edge of the yard. She thought about what someone careful and observant might have seen. I spent most of that afternoon keeping the kids from fighting, she said, and I spent most of it keeping my brother Robert from drinking the whole cooler himself. Walter almost smiled. We were busy the whole time. Silas wasn't. No, Walter said. He wasn't. They told the children the next day. Walter called Diane first because she was the oldest, because he still held on to old habits even when he was no longer sure why. Diane's response was measured for approximately 4 seconds before the measurement failed. A cabin in Montana. He could barely walk to the mailbox. He couldn't handle property in the middle of nowhere. She would handle the sale. They would split the proceeds. That was the smart thing. Walter said, it's not yours to handle. Diane's voice changed. The warmth she had been maintaining, the concerned daughter performance she had kept running for the past year and a half, cut off like a power line in a storm. She told him that if he was going to be selfish, that was his choice, but he should not come to her when the situation became impossible. Brett called 10 minutes later. He had not been told. Diane had called him. He called his father ungrateful and hung up. Carol sent a text 3 hours after that. Busy, can't talk, hope everything's okay. Owen called at 10 o'clock that night. His voice was low, careful, the voice of someone checking whether a room next door was occupied. Dad, he said, be careful. Diane is already talking to a lawyer about the estate. Walter sat down. When did she start? There was a pause. I told her about the letter. I'm sorry, I didn't think she'd move that fast. Another pause longer. I'm sorry, Dad. The line went quiet. Owen had hung up. Walter set the phone on the table. Eleanor looked at him from across the kitchen, and he looked back at her, and he turned the conversation over in his mind. He told her, Eleanor said. Yes, and then he called to warn us. That's something. I don't know what it is yet. Walter was quiet for a moment. But it's not nothing. The Greyhound station on East Gay Street smelled of diesel exhaust and the particular institutional cleaning product that Walter associated with every waiting room he had ever been forced to spend time in. They arrived with 2 duffel bags and a backpack, everything they owned distributed between 3 bags, which was an accurate accounting of what 3 years of systematic extraction had left them. Walter carried his small toolkit in the backpack. The essentials only: an adjustable wrench, a multi-head screwdriver, needle-nose pliers, a utility knife. Eleanor had asked him why standing in the apartment while they packed, and he had said he didn't know what condition the cabin was in. That was true. The other truth which he did not say was that holding the tools when his hands trembled made the trembling less. 3 days on the bus, Ohio to Indiana to Illinois. The land flattening and then flattening further small towns, blurring past with their identical main streets and their identical expressions of something that had once been prosperous and was now enduring. Then somewhere past the Iowa border, the land began to change. Hills appeared tentatively, at first, then with conviction. Trees thickened, the sky expanded in a way that was almost physical, as if the compression of urban Ohio had been imposing a ceiling on the world and someone had finally removed it. On the third night crossing into Montana, Walter was awake while Eleanor slept against his shoulder. The darkness outside the window was different here, a darkness that contained things rather than concealing them, mountains and rivers, and distances that went on past where light could reach. He took out a piece of paper from his jacket pocket, the one on which he had written Harold Whitmore's address, and turned it over to the blank side. In his careful, slightly trembling handwriting, he wrote 4 names: Diane, Brett, Carol, Owen, beside each name a number, the amount they had taken, and the date. He looked at the list for a long time, then he folded it and put it back in his pocket. Not to remember. He already remembered. He put it there to mark the moment he decided these people had made their choices. He was making his. Harold Whitmore was waiting at the Helena bus station in a dusty pickup truck with Montana plates and a bumper sticker that read, "Keep Montana Wild." He was in his early 70s, silver-haired, weathered in the way that people become weathered when they have spent decades in a landscape that does not accommodate vanity. His handshake was firm, and his eyes were the kind of calm that comes from having handled a great many complicated situations over a long career without losing his equilibrium. He drove them through Helena, which spread through the valley between mountains, with the unplanned logic of a town that had grown around gold rather than planning, and then out of town onto roads that narrowed progressively, pavement to gravel, gravel to dirt, dirt to twin ruts through the trees. The air coming through the vents had a quality that was difficult to name clean in a way that made Eleanor realize she had been breathing air that was not this clean for years without noticing the difference. Silas bought this land in 1953, Whitmore said, one hand on the wheel. Paid cash, built the cabin over 2 summers, did the framing and the log work himself. He was 28 years old and he had decided he wanted a life that was specifically his own. He was a happy man, Eleanor asked. I think he was a deliberate man, Whitmore said. Whether that's the same as happy depends on how you define it. Then just before Eleanor could follow the thought any further, Whitmore said, he first discussed the estate arrangements with me in 1987, after the family reunion in Oregon. He glanced in the rearview mirror. He said he'd made a decision about who he wanted to protect. He was very clear that it was a decision, not an impulse. Walter did not look at Eleanor, but he felt her go still beside him. 1987. Silas had sat at the edge of the yard watching and had made a decision. Whatever he had seen that afternoon, it had been enough, and he had spent the next 7 years building something to act on it. The trees opened into a clearing, and the cabin was there bathed in the last angle of evening light. 2 stories of hand-hewn logs darkened by weathering to the color of dark honey, a steeply pitched roof in aged green metal, a wide porch running across the front with railings carved in patterns of leaves and vines. Behind it, the mountains rose against the sky, and somewhere in the distance, an owl was calling. Whitmore stopped the truck and turned off the engine. The silence that came in was absolute. No traffic, no voices, just the cooling tick of the engine and the wind moving through the pines. He handed Walter the key, brass worn smooth along the bow by the repeated pressure of the same hand over many years. Walter turned it in his palm. He could feel the smoothness of it, the way a tool feels when it has been used daily by someone who cared for it. His taxes are paid through a trust for the next 50 years, Whitmore said. The well pump works. The solar system was serviced 2 years ago. There's a care package inside. He helped them with the bags, and then he drove back down the dirt road, and his taillights disappeared into the trees, and Walter and Eleanor stood in the clearing in the growing dark. Stars were appearing overhead. More stars than Eleanor had seen since childhood, more than she had believed could be visible, scattered across the black sky with a density that seemed impossible, as if someone had been careless with something precious and scattered it everywhere. Walter walked to the cabin door. He put the key in the lock. It turned without resistance, smoothly and completely, the way a properly maintained lock turns when you use the right key. The door opened on a room that was warm with the residual heat of good insulation and the smell of wood smoke, and something herbal dried thyme or rosemary hung in bundles somewhere. Bookshelves lined the walls. A stone fireplace dominated the north end. The furniture was solid and simple leather and worn to softness by use a table with 6 chairs, a workbench in the corner, with tools hung on pegboard in organized rows. Walter walked to the workbench first. He stood in front of it and looked at the tools. They were clean, properly hung. Every tool in its place and a visible place for every tool. He reached out and lifted a hand plane from its hook, felt its balance, set it back. Then he turned to Eleanor, who was standing in the middle of the room with a book in her hand, looking at him with an expression he
ready?
had not seen
As
on
ready
her
as
face
I'll
in a
ever
long
be.
time. Someone lived well here,
Let's see
she
what's
said.
left.
Yes, Walter said. She held up the book. It was a notebook, old leather, the cover cracked and soft. The first page in a hand.
It's so
he did
warm
not
by
yet
the
know,
fire.
but would come
Just like
to
our first
recognize
winter
read
here.
Day one.
I love
I
it.
have found the place to keep what is
Steady
most
now.
worth
Let's
keeping.
see what we've got.
No one will
Be
find
careful,
it
the
here.
light is flickering.
Only someone who deserves to
Are you
find
ready
it.
to see
January
it?
7th,
Yes, let's see what we've
1963.
uncovered.
Eleanor looked
Look
at
at that
Walter across
necklace,
the
it's
room,
beautiful.
across
It
the
is.
warm air of the cabin that Silas Aldrich had built with his own hands 70 years ago. Walter, she said quietly, what was he keeping? Walter did not sleep that first night. Not because the bed was uncomfortable, which it was not, the mattress firm and the quilts heavy with the smell of cedar. Not because the silence was unfamiliar, though it was. He did not sleep because somewhere around 2 in the morning, lying on his back in the dark, with Eleanor breathing steadily beside him, he realized he had been listening to the cabin. A mechanic listens to things the way most people look at them. He had been doing it without deciding to, running a background audit of every sound the structure made as the temperature dropped outside and the wood contracted and the fire in the stone hearth settled into coals. The sounds were telling him something he had almost caught during the walkthrough the previous evening, but had not quite assembled into a coherent conclusion. He got up carefully, pulled on his clothes in the dark, and went downstairs with the flashlight. He stood in the center of the main room and did what he had been doing unconsciously all evening. He walked it, not quickly. With the particular deliberate attention he had applied to aircraft interiors for 34 years, which was the attention of someone who understood that hidden problems do not announce themselves, they have to be found. He walked the perimeter first. The walls were solid, the logs fitted with the precision of someone who had taken real time to do the work right. The bookshelves were built into the walls, not freestanding, and the books on them were real red, their spines cracked at different angles from use. He pulled one out. A Natural History of the American West, published 1961. Inside the front cover, in small, neat handwriting, Essay March 1962. A man who marked his books. Then Walter walked the floor. He went slowly, heel to toe, the way you walk when you are listening to what is under you, rather than looking at what is in front of you. The wide pine planks were solid everywhere. He stepped properly, joisted, no give, no complaint, until he reached the area in front of the stone fireplace. There, approximately 4 feet from the hearth, the sound changed. It was subtle, a fraction of a tone lower, the difference between a note played on a full drum and the same note played on one that has been muted from beneath. He stopped, tapped his heel twice. The sound was unmistakable to anyone who had spent decades listening for exactly this kind of variance. He stepped to the side and tapped again. Solid, back to the original spot, hollow. He stood there for a long moment, the flashlight beam aimed at the floor, and then he turned it toward the fireplace. The stone fireplace consumed the entire north wall, floor to ceiling, built from river stones fitted together with almost no visible mortar. It was the kind of masonry work that took real skill and real patience, not a weekend project, but a summer's worth of careful work. Walter had looked at it the previous evening with the appreciation of someone who understood what it took to do something like that, but he had been tired and overwhelmed, and he had not looked at it the way he was looking at it now. He moved the flashlight slowly across the face of the stones. They were all different, some round and smooth, some angular, each one chosen for how it would fit against its neighbors. The proportions of the fireplace were slightly off. The face of it was deeper than it needed to be for the firebox it contained, and the stone columns on either side were thicker than the structural load required. He had noticed this without cataloging it. Now he cataloged it. He placed his left hand flat against the stone column on the right side of the firebox and began pressing. systematically starting at the bottom, working upward. Most of the stones did not move at all. Some shifted infinitesimally, the normal behavior of stone and mortar that had settled over 60 years. At approximately 4 feet above the floor, third stone from the outer edge, his palm registered something different. A give that was not settling, a give that was mechanical. He pressed harder. The stone moved inward with a soft, deliberate resistance, like a button designed to be pressed. And then there was a sound from somewhere below his feet. Stone against stone, a slow grinding, unmistakable, and utterly deliberate. He stepped back fast. The floor section in front of the fireplace separated along lines that had been invisible 2 seconds ago. A 4-foot square, the edges precise as a carpenter's mount. The crack was dark, and it exhaled cool air that smelled of stone and old paper and something else. Something mineral and dry that did not have a name but felt very old. Eleanor. He said it at normal volume. Then again, louder, tilting his head toward the stairs. Eleanor. She appeared at the top of the stairs in 40 seconds, hair loose, pulling a quilt around her shoulders. She looked at him, then at the floor, then at him again. "How long have you been down here?" she said. "An hour, maybe more." She came down the stairs and stood beside him, and they both looked at the 4-foot square of separated floor in silence. "You found a trigger stone," she said. Not a question. She had watched him do exactly this kind of systematic search on the cabin's mechanical systems the previous evening, and she understood what she was looking at. Third from the edge, about 4 feet up on the right column. Eleanor looked at the opening. The flashlight beam did not reach the bottom. "We should wait until morning," she said. "We could." A pause. "You're not going to." "I'm not going to." He found the crowbar on Silas's workbench, the one hanging between the claw hammer and the pry bar, each tool on its own labeled hook. The floor panel lifted with a precision that confirmed what the workmanship had already suggested. This had been designed to be open, the panel counterbalanced somehow beneath its apparent weight, a fraction of what solid pine that thick should weigh. Below it, stone steps descended into darkness. 12 of them, Walter counted, carved directly into the foundation, each one worn smooth at the center from years of use. He went first. Eleanor followed with the oil lamp from the mantel, which she had lit with the long matches from the tin beside the fireplace, moving with the practiced calm of someone who had spent decades being useful in situations that required calm. The lamp's light expanded as they reached the bottom, and the room revealed itself incrementally, the way a photograph develops detail by detail until the full image is present. It was largely the same footprint as the main room above. The ceiling was vaulted, supported by hand-hewn beams that were old enough to have darkened to nearly black. The walls were the same river stone as the fireplace, fitted with the same care, and filling that space arranged with the organizational precision of someone who had been adding to it for decades and had thought carefully about how each addition related to everything that came before it was a collection. Wooden crates stacked in rows along the walls, each one labeled in small, neat handwriting with a letter number code. Open shelving, holding leather-bound ledgers and document boxes. Smaller cases in dark velvet on a separate shelf. A canvas tarp over something large in the far corner. And at the center of the room, a desk that was cleaner and more organized than any workspace Walter had ever maintained, which was saying something. He set the flashlight on the desk, and they stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly, taking it in. Eleanor moved to the desk and opened the large leather-bound notebook at the center of it. The cover read in embossed letters, worn nearly smooth, "Private Collection and Estate Records. Property of Silas James Aldrich. Begun January 7th, 1963. Below that, in different ink added later, "For Walter and Eleanor, if you choose to look. Everything here is yours now. I trust you will know what to do. Silas." Walter opened the nearest crate while Eleanor read. The packing was old newspaper from 1968, brittle at the edges, which he handled carefully, unfolding it layer by layer until he reached what was inside. A painting. Oil on canvas, perhaps 36 inches by 24. He lifted it toward the lamp, and the colors came alive, mountains under dramatic clouds rendered in the bold, confident strokes of someone who had understood landscape as emotional experience rather than documentation. In the lower right corner, the signature was small and certain, A. Bierstadt. He set it carefully against the desk and looked at Eleanor. She was reading from the notebook, her finger tracing a column of figures. Her voice when she spoke was careful, the voice of someone reading a map in the unfamiliar territory. Albert Bierstadt, landscape oil on canvas, purchased April 15, 1963, estate sale in Portland, $375. She paused. Current estimated value. She stopped. How much? Walter said. $52,000. Walter looked at the painting. He looked at it for a long time, really looked at it, the quality of the light in it, the scale of the mountains against the human-sized clouds. He was not a man who had spent time in museums or thought much about art, but he understood, standing there in the lamplight, that this was not a decorative object. This was the work of someone who had looked at something true about the world and had found a way to make other people see it too. He opened another crate, then another. Eleanor read while he unpacked, and together they built a picture of what Silas Aldrich had spent 37 years assembling. A first edition Shakespeare folio in a climate-controlled box purchased for $800, now worth $120,000. 3 paintings by Andrew Wyeth, bought in 1971 for a combined $800 from a San Francisco gallery that had not yet understood what it had. A bronze equestrian sculpture with a green patina, Roman coins in individual velvet cases labeled with their origins, and dates first edition novels by writers whose names were now taught in universities. A framed map dated 1702 showing the American West as a region of speculation and blank space. And then the financial instruments. Eleanor found them in the second set of ledgers, the ones on the separate shelf. Stock certificates in companies that had become, in the decades since Silas acquired them, foundational to the American economy. Apple Computer, acquired in 1976 for $10,000. IBM, Microsoft, others whose names were now so embedded in daily life that it was difficult to remember they had once been small enough to represent a gamble. In the personal journal, a smaller notebook with a cracked leather cover that Eleanor found in the desk drawer, Silas had recorded the reasoning behind each acquisition in the flat, specific language of a man who had been trained as an accountant and had never entirely stopped thinking like one. For the Apple investment, 2 young men in a garage in Cupertino, he wrote, possibly foolish, but I have learned to trust my judgment on questions of whether something is genuinely new or merely appearing to be new. This is genuinely new. Eleanor sat down on a crate and kept reading. Walter kept opening boxes. The final page of the main ledger was a summary dated September 2nd, 1994. Silas had conducted professional appraisals through Christie's and Sotheby's the previous August, their authentication documents filed in the document boxes on the shelf, each one cross-referenced to its entry in the ledger. Walter sat beside Eleanor while she read the total aloud. Paintings and sculpture, $73,200,000. Rare books and manuscripts, $18,500,000. Coins and precious metals, $42,800,000. Stocks and bonds, $112,300,000. Miscellaneous, $18,200,000. Total estimated value, $265 million. Walter sat with that number for 2 full minutes, not because he was calculating, because he was trying to understand what it meant about the man who had assembled it alone in secret over 37 years in a cabin in the mountains of Montana. He was a bookkeeper from Seattle, Walter said finally. Eleanor said, and he lived up here like he had nothing. He lived up here like he had chosen what he actually wanted. Eleanor turned another page in the personal journal. There's a difference. She handed it to him. He read the entry she was pointing to, dated March 14th, 1973. Attended the funeral of Walter's mother today. Stood at the back. Walter supported his brothers when they were too deep in grief to stand on their own, did it without calling attention to himself, as if it were simply what the moment required. Eleanor organized everything that needed organizing, the flowers and the seating, the food after. No one thanked her. I watched her face during the entire service. She knew no one was watching, and she did it anyway. That kind of character is not common. Walter read it twice. Then he closed the journal and set it on the desk and sat for a moment with his hands resting on his knees. His hands were still. He noticed that. The tremor that had been his constant companion for 3 years was not entirely absent, but it was quieter than it had been in a long time. He saw us, Eleanor said, when no one else was looking. He saw us before we saw it ourselves. She opened the journal to a second entry, July 1987, the one from the Oregon reunion. Walter read it in silence. I watched Walter and Eleanor with their children today. The children take without awareness that they are taking. They have been taught without anyone intending to teach them that their parents are a resource rather than people. I see where this leads. I see the exhaustion in both of them, the way Eleanor hides it, and the way Walter carries it differently externally in his posture. Someone should do something about this. Perhaps that someone is me. I have been building something for 30 years that I have no one to leave. Perhaps I have been building it for them without knowing. Eleanor stood up and walked to the far corner of the room, lifted the canvas tarp from the large object there. It was a glass display case museum quality, the velvet interior holding jewelry, a diamond necklace that caught the lamplight and threw small rainbows onto the stone wall, a ruby brooch the size of a silver dollar, a sapphire ring of deep and specific blue. A small card inside the case read, "Personal collection, mostly gifts I received but never wore. Estimated value $4,700,000. He received gifts, Eleanor said quietly. Someone gave him these. And he never wore them. No. She looked at the jewelry for a moment. He kept them. They spent another 2 hours in the room working through the ledgers, cross-referencing the authentication documents, reading more of the personal journal. By the time they climbed back up the stone stairs, the cabin windows were beginning to show the pale gray that preceded Montana sunrise. Walter reset the floor panel. It settled back into place with a soft finality, the edges disappearing into the surrounding grain as if they had never been separated. Standing above it, you would not know. At the kitchen table with cold coffee, Eleanor said, "We can't tell anyone yet." "No. When they find out, and they will find out, we need to already have walls around this." Walter nodded. "Whitmore first, then whoever Whitmore recommends. But not until we understand what we have." Eleanor looked out the window at the forest, which was becoming visible as the light built the dark shapes of the pines resolving into individual trees. "He left us a letter," she said. She had found it in the back of the main ledger, unsealed in the same neat handwriting. She read it aloud. "Walter, Eleanor, if you are reading this, you have found the collection. I imagine you are overwhelmed, perhaps frightened. Let me say what I can. Do not rush. Take time to understand what you have. Talk to professionals you trust. And do not let this fortune change who you are. You are good people. That is why I chose you. The money is a tool and nothing more. Use it to build the life you want to help others who deserve help. Your children will come. I am sorry for that because I know what they will do when they find out, and I know they will find out. Stand firm. This is yours, not theirs. They made their choices long before I made mine. Build something beautiful. That is all I ask of you. Yours in trust and respect, Silas." They sat in silence when Eleanor finished reading. Outside, a woodpecker began working at a tree somewhere in the near forest, a rapid percussion against the quiet. "He knew," Walter said. "He prepared. Both." Walter wrapped both hands around his coffee mug, feeling the residual warmth of it. He sat in that yard in 1987, and he saw what was coming for us 20 years before it happened. And instead of warning us, which we probably wouldn't have believed, he spent the next 7 years building a wall. The whole collection, not just the collection, us. He was building us a way out of whatever they were going to do to us. Eleanor set down her mug. He deserved better than dying alone up here. Maybe. Walter looked out at the forest. Or maybe this was the life he wanted, and the fortune was the only companion he needed. They did not speak about the collection for 3 days. They went about the work of settling into the cabin, learning its systems, finding the rhythms of a life without utilities or delivery services, or the ambient noise of a city that never fully went quiet. Walter spent time at Silas's workbench, not building or repairing, just handling the tools, getting familiar with the logic of another craftsman's organization. Eleanor explored the property, found the stream on the western edge, the remains of a kitchen garden that had gone wild, the grove of aspens that shivered their leaves in the breeze as if perpetually startled. On the 4th day, they drove into Cedar Falls. The town was 20 minutes down the mountain on a road that improved gradually from dirt to gravel to a 2-lane state highway. 347 residents, according to the sign at the edge of town. A general store, a diner, a gas station, a post office, and a small brick building with a handwritten sign in the window that read Cedar Falls Public Library, Tuesday through Saturday, 9 to 4 donations welcome. Dorothy Ashford was behind the desk when they walked in. A woman in her late 60s with silver hair, pulled back and reading glasses perched on her nose, and she looked up at them with the particular attention of someone who had been waiting for them to arrive without knowing exactly when they would. "You must be the Cranes," she said. "I heard someone finally came up to Silas's place. I'm Dorothy, town librarian, local historian, and the person who has been quietly keeping track of Silas Aldrich for 40 years without ever quite being able to explain why." She made tea. They sat in chairs near her desk, and she told them what she knew, which was more than Walter had expected, and told through the careful observation of someone who paid close attention to things. Silas had arrived in 1953, she said. Young private, purposeful. He came to town once a month for supplies, always paid cash, never lingered. He was not unfriendly, he was contained. There was a difference, Dorothy said, and she had spent a long time learning to see it. When did you know he was more than a hermit? Eleanor asked. When he mentioned once almost in passing that he had attended an auction in Portland. I asked what kind of auction. He said art and antiquities. Dorothy smiled at the memory. He said it the same way someone else might say they had gone to the hardware store. I started paying attention after that. She went to a filing cabinet and brought back a manila folder thick with clippings and handwritten notes. Articles from art magazines and financial papers spanning 4 decades. Each one annotated in pencil at the margin. Silas bought similar 1963. Silas invested 1976. Silas acquired 3 before the market recognized the name. Eleanor looked at the folder and then at Dorothy. You tracked his investments. I tracked his thinking, Dorothy said precisely. He would mention things in conversation, never directly, always obliquely, and I would research them afterward. He was always ahead. Not by accident. He had a system for identifying value before consensus arrived. Walter said he was a bookkeeper. He was a bookkeeper who read everything that Dorothy said, and who trusted his own judgment more than he trusted anyone else's. That combination is rarer than it sounds. Then Eleanor said, was he lonely? Dorothy set down her tea. She did not answer immediately, and when she did, her voice was careful. I think he chose his circumstances. Whether that means he was not lonely, I honestly cannot say. He was a man who had decided something about what he needed and what he didn't, and he lived according to that decision. I respected him enormously. I also thought sometimes that he had priced companionship too high and paid for it accordingly. Eleanor was quiet. Walter could see her turning that over. Dorothy reached into the filing cabinet one more time and produced a photograph in a cracked frame. A younger Silas, perhaps 35, standing in front of the cabin in summer. He was not smiling, but his eyes held an expression of settled satisfaction, the look of someone standing in the exact place they had decided to be. He gave this to me years ago, Dorothy said. He said if anything happened to him, I should give it to whoever came to the cabin. He said they would want to know he had been at peace here. Eleanor took the photograph with both hands. They thanked Dorothy and drove back up the mountain with the photograph on the seat between them, and 2 days of relative peace followed, which was long enough for Walter to begin understanding the dimensions of what they had inherited, and short enough that they had not yet had time to prepare for what was coming. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Walter's cell phone, which he had nearly forgotten to charge. He looked at the screen. Diane. He answered. Her voice was not the voice she had used when she was performing concern. It was the voice underneath that performance, the one that had been there all along, precise and without warmth. I know Silas Aldrich was not just a hermit with a cabin. Walter said nothing. I hired someone to research him 2 weeks ago, Diane said. After you told us about the inheritance, I found his auction records, his tax filings from the 70s and 80s, the names of the dealers he worked with in Seattle and Portland. A pause calibrated for effect. He was a collector, Dad, a serious one, and everything he collected is now yours, which means it belongs to the family. Walter stood up. He did this without thinking about it. The physical posture following the decision, a half-second before the decision was fully articulated, he was not going to have this conversation sitting down. Diane, he said, you took our house. You took 37 years of savings. You took the money we had set aside for the contingencies of getting old, which is the money people need most and can replace least. You did that over 14 months, piece by piece, with reasons that sounded like love. And when it was gone, you told us to find our own housing. He paused. Tell me what part of that makes you family. You're being emotional. I'm being precise. There's a difference. You're not capable of managing something like this. You had a stroke. You're 73 years old and you're living in the woods with no one to help you and a fortune you don't understand. Then let me be very clear about what I understand. What Silas left us is ours, not the family's. Ours. He was specific about that for reasons that are now obvious. And whatever you are planning to do about that, do it. But understand that we are not the people you left in that apartment above the restaurant. We have had time to think, and we have started making preparations. Diane's voice went flat and cold. We are coming up there, all of us, the day after tomorrow. Walter ended the call. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, then walked outside onto the porch. The mountains were in their late afternoon light, the shadows long, and the peaks still bright. He breathed in the air, which tasted of pine and cold stone. Eleanor appeared at the doorway behind him. She had heard enough. "How long do we have?" she said. "2 days." She nodded. "Then call Whitmore." "Now. Right now." She looked at the mountains. He said Silas was a planner. Let's find out how well he planned. Walter went inside to make the call. Eleanor stayed on the porch a moment longer, looking at the tree line where the forest began its climb up the mountain. Silas had built this place with his own hands, she thought. He had built it to last, and somewhere under the floor of it, in the stone room that smelled of old paper and mineral cold, 37 years of his patience and foresight were waiting to find out whether his judgment about 2 people he had barely known had been correct. 3 days later, they got their first answer. Not the one they had been waiting for. Something worse came first. Walter and Eleanor returned from an afternoon in Cedar Falls, a trip to the library to use Dorothy's internet connection for research that needed to stay off their own devices, and they came back to a broken window in the kitchen. The single pane glass above the sink punched through cleanly, the latch on the interior frame forced. Inside, someone had been through the desk drawers, not violently, not randomly. The desk had been searched by someone who knew how to search drawers, replaced in order papers disturbed but not scattered. The kind of search that tries to conceal itself, which told you more about the searcher than a careless ransacking would have. The vault beneath the floor untouched, intact, still holding everything Silas had kept for 37 years. Sheriff Ray Holbrook
Are you
arrived
ready?
in 20 minutes.
As
a
ready
big
as
man
I'll
in his
ever be.
50s who moved through the cabin
Let's see what's
with
left.
the unhurried efficiency of someone who had seen the full catalog of human failure and was no longer surprised by any entry in it.
It's so
He
warm
looked
by
at
the
window,
fire.
the desk, the
Just like
pattern
our
of
first winter
disturbance.
here.
Then he said to
I
Walter
love
quietly,
it.
"I pulled the camera
Steady
footage from
now.
the gas
Let's see what
station
we've
at the
got."
foot of your road.
Be careful,
There
the
was a
light is
vehicle
flickering.
parked at the turnoff for about 40 minutes
Are you
this
ready to
afternoon,
see it?
around
Yes,
the time
let's
you
see
would have
what
been
we've
in town.
uncovered.
The
Look at that
vehicle
necklace,
belongs
it's
to a Marcus
beautiful.
Hale
It is.
reporter for the Mountain West Courier out of Billings. He was up here the day after your children's visit asking questions in town. Walter said he works for Diane. I can't prove that, not yet, but I can tell you he didn't come here to write a travel piece. Holbrook looked at him steadily. I'm going to post a patrol up here at night until this settles, and I'm going to have a conversation with the gentleman. After Holbrook left, Owen called. Walter had been expecting it, though not quite this soon. Owen's voice was tired in the specific way of someone who had been carrying something that was getting heavier. They know more than you think, Owen said. Diane has been building a file for 2 weeks. She's going to file for emergency guardianship. Her argument is that you're isolated, that you're under the influence of outside counsel, and that Dad's stroke makes him legally vulnerable to financial exploitation. A long pause. She borrowed money to pay the lawyer. Brett did too. They're counting on recovering it from the estate. Eleanor, sitting across from Walter with the phone between them on speaker, said, "And you, Owen, what are you counting on?" The silence that followed was long enough to be its own answer. I withdrew my name from the petition this morning, Owen said. I'm not part of it. I know that doesn't fix what I did. I'm not calling because I think it does. His voice dropped. I'm calling because you need to know what's coming, and because I owe you at least that much. Eleanor looked at Walter. Walter looked at the window with its missing pane, the evening air now moving through the gap and carrying the first cold edge of what the night would become. We know what's coming, Walter said into the phone. Then he said something he had not planned to say, something that arrived from a place in him he had not known was still open. Thank you for calling, Owen. He ended the call and set the phone on the table. Outside, the light was failing over the mountains, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called out once and then was silent, and the sound of it moved through the pines and faded into the enormous Montana quiet, and Walter Crane sat in the cabin that a man he had barely known had spent a lifetime building and waited for what would come next. The morning of the hearing, Walter woke before 4. He did not lie in bed the way he had on other difficult mornings, cataloging what was coming and what it might cost. He got up dressed in the dark and went down to Silas's workbench. He did not turn on the overhead light. He worked by the small lamp mounted above the bench, the one with the green glass shade that cast a focused circle of warm yellow over the surface. He opened his toolkit and took out each piece one at a time. The adjustable wrench, the needle nose pliers, the multi-head screwdriver, the utility knife. He set them in a row on the bench and inspected each one the way he had inspected them thousands of times, not because they needed inspection, but because the act of it was itself a kind of preparation, a settling of attention, a return to the self that knew what it was doing. Patricia Oakes found him there at 6:30 when she arrived with Whitmore to drive them into Helena. She stood in the doorway of the workroom for a moment before he heard her. "We need to leave in 40 minutes, she said. "I know." She came in and leaned it against the door frame, watching him close the kit. She was a compact woman in her early 50s, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that composed silence in a room was often more useful than anything you could say in it. "You're going to be asked to speak directly. The judge may ask you questions. Just tell the truth in the order it happened." Walter snapped the kit closed. "I've been telling the truth in the order it happened for 73 years. The people in that courtroom are the ones who have been doing something else." Patricia looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "they are." In the truck on the way down the mountain, Eleanor sat with Silas's photograph in her coat pocket, a habit she had developed without deciding to the way people carry things that anchor them. The road was still dark under the trees, the headlights cutting through a low morning mist that lay along the valley floor. Whitmore drove. He did not offer reassurance, which Walter appreciated. He had known enough men of Whitmore's type, the quiet, competent ones who showed their confidence not by talking about the outcome, but by simply showing up prepared for it. And this morning, Whitmore had the particular focused quiet of someone who had done his preparation and was satisfied with it. The Jefferson County Courthouse had stood since 1923, a stone building with columns that had absorbed a century of Montana winters and had the look of something that intended to absorb a century more. They arrived at 8:30. The hallway outside the courtroom was already occupied. Diane stood near the water fountain at the far end in a navy blazer pressed to precision. Brett sat on a bench with his knee moving his tie slightly wrong, the look of a man who had convinced himself he was about to receive something he deserved. Carol sat apart from them near the exit doors, and when Eleanor walked past, she looked up, and for a single unguarded second, her face held something that was not greed and not calculation. It was the face of someone who had gotten much farther into a situation than she had intended and could not find the door she had come in through. Eleanor did not stop, but she saw it. Gerald Stowe, the attorney the children had retained, was conferring with two associates in the corner. He was the kind of lawyer whose confidence came from repetition rather than conviction, a man who had filed this type of petition before, who knew the procedural language, who believed the weight of professional machinery would be sufficient. He glanced at Patricia Oakes once and then returned to his papers. What filled the benches behind the bar was something Stowe had not accounted for. Dorothy Ashford was there in a gray wool coat, sitting with the composure of someone prepared to wait as long as necessary. Sheriff Holbrook was there in full uniform, his hat in his lap, the owner of the general store in Cedar Falls, the mechanic who had sold Walter the truck. A dozen other faces Walter had seen in town, but not yet had occasion to know by name. They had driven down from the mountain on a Thursday morning to sit in a courthouse, which was the kind of thing that happened in small communities when the community had decided that something needed to be witnessed. Walter looked at those faces as he took his seat and did not look away from them for a long moment. Judge Caroline Winters entered at 9 o'clock exactly. She was in her early 60s, silver-haired, and she carried her authority the way experienced judges do not, as something she asserted, but as something that simply attended her. She had been on this bench for 31 years, and her eyes moving across the room as she settled into her chair had the quality of eyes that had seen every variation of human behavior that a courtroom could produce and had made their peace with the full catalog. Gerald Stowe presented his case first. His argument was structured and clean. Walter Crane had suffered a documented neurological event 3 years prior that affected motor function. Both Walter and Eleanor were living in an isolated location without family support. The estate they had inherited was of a size and complexity that required professional management. Their children, concerned for their welfare, were seeking the legal standing to ensure that management was appropriate and that their parents were not being unduly influenced by outside counsel who stood to benefit from the arrangement. He used the word loving 4 times in 12 minutes. Patricia Oakes stood when he finished. She placed 3 folders on the clerk's desk and asked that they be entered as exhibits. Then she turned to address the judge directly, and her voice had the particular quality of someone presenting facts that do not require ornamentation. The first folder contained bank records, spanning 14 months documenting the transfer of $137,000 from Walter and Eleanor Crane's joint account to accounts belonging to the four petitioners. Each transfer was annotated with the stated reason and the date. None of the funds had been repaid, not $1. The second folder contained the records from the Elmhurst Avenue apartment, the social services applications, the waitlist correspondence from Tiffany Wells's office. It documented precisely and without editorial comment the period during which Walter and Eleanor Crane had been, in the clinical language of the documents, housing insecure and financially dependent on public assistance while living in a building owned by a third party, having been asked to leave the home of the eldest petitioner. The third folder contained 2 independent psychological evaluations conducted by licensed practitioners with no connection to either party, both of which concluded that Walter and Eleanor Crane demonstrated full cognitive competency, clear decision-making capacity, and no evidence of undue susceptibility to outside influence. One of the evaluators had noted in language that went slightly beyond the clinical standard that both subjects showed remarkable clarity of judgment and emotional resilience in light of what they had experienced. Patricia addressed the court. The petitioners are not here because they are concerned about Walter and Eleanor Crane. They are here because they were not named in a will. That is the complete and accurate description of this case. Everything else is a performance of concern designed to achieve a financial outcome. Stowe objected. Judge Winters overruled it with a look rather than a word. The judge asked to hear directly from Walter and Eleanor. Eleanor went first. She did not use notes. She stood with her hands at her sides, and she spoke in the voice she had developed over 37 years of delivering difficult information to people who needed to hear it clearly. Not gently, but honestly, because honest information was what allowed people to make real decisions. She did not speak about money. She spoke about a Sunday afternoon in September 3 years ago when she had come home from a double shift to find that Walter had made dinner just soup and bread, but the table was set and there was a candle lit because he knew she was tired and he wanted her to come home to something that said someone had been thinking about her. She spoke about the oak tree in the yard of the house they had sold, the one she had planted from a seedling the year Diane was born, and how she had not been able to go back and see what the new owners had done with the yard because she was not ready for that yet. She spoke about what it felt like to live in a room above a restaurant and hear the sounds of other people's ordinary lives through the floor every night, and understand without self-pity, but with complete clarity, that her children had chosen not to notice. Then she said, I am not asking this court to feel sorry for us. I am asking this court to recognize that the man who left us, what he left us, was not confused, and we are not confused. He saw something in us that was worth trusting. We would like the opportunity to prove he was right. Judge Winters looked at Walter. He stood. He did not have Eleanor's 37 years of delivering news to strangers. He had a different kind of practice, the kind that came from spending a working life in environments where imprecision had consequences, and where the most important thing you could do was identify exactly what was wrong and say so without decoration. He looked at the judge, not at his children. I fixed aircraft engines for 34 years, he said. When something was broken, I said so. When something looked broken but wasn't, I said that too. The difference mattered because the consequences of getting it wrong were real. He paused. What my children are describing as concern is not concern. I know what their concern looked like. I lived with it for 50 years. This is something else. And I believe this court can see the difference as clearly as I can. He sat down. Judge Winters was quiet for a moment. Then she said, before I issue a ruling, there is a document to be entered into the record. This document was filed with this court under seal by Harold Whitmore of Whitmore and Associates on behalf of his client, Celis James Aldrich. The filing instructions state that it is to be opened in the event of any legal challenge to the disposition of Mr. Aldrich's estate. Gerald Stowe looked up from his papers. Your Honor, I have no knowledge of any such filing. You would not, Judge Winters said. It was filed in 1994. She accepted the envelope from her clerk. It was old, the paper the color of aged cream, sealed with red wax, bearing an impress that had hardened and held for 30 years. She broke it with a letter opener and removed several pages which she read in silence. The courtroom was as quiet as Walter had ever heard a room full of people be. When the judge looked up, her expression had changed in a way that was difficult to name. Not softened, deepened perhaps. She read aloud. To whatever court receives this document, my name is Silas James Aldrich. I am writing this in July of 1994 in full possession of my faculties, a fact that Harold Whitmore, who is witnessing this document, can attest to. I am writing it because I want there to be no ambiguity about the decisions I have made regarding my estate, and because I am aware that those decisions may be contested after my death by people who believe they have a claim that supersedes my own wishes. I am leaving everything I own to Walter and Eleanor Crane, my distant cousins, people I have observed over the course of nearly 2 decades at family gatherings from a distance without their knowledge. I have watched how they conduct themselves when they believe no one important is watching. I have seen the quality of their character under conditions that reveal character. My decision is based on what I have seen, not on proximity or obligation. Judge Winters turned the page. I am also aware that the children of Walter and Eleanor Crane have over the years of my observation demonstrated a pattern of behavior toward their parents that I find troubling. I do not expect this pattern to change when the children learn of my estate. I expect the opposite. Therefore, I am including the following provision. She read it clearly and without inflection, the language of a man who had spent his working life ensuring that numbers and agreements were precise. Any family member of Walter and Eleanor Crane who contests this will file legal action challenging the disposition of this estate or pursues guardianship proceedings against Walter, and Eleanor Crane shall be permanently barred from receiving any benefit from this estate, including any benefit from charitable or philanthropic entities established using funds from this estate now or in the future. This provision is not punitive. It is simply the logical extension of the choice those individuals will have made by taking such action. Choices have consequences. I have always believed that. Judge Winters set the pages down and looked at the petitioner's table. Diane was very still. The particular stillness of someone whose internal calculations are running fast and arriving at outcomes they do not like. Brett was looking at the table. Carol had her eyes closed. The judge said, in 31 years on this bench, I have read a great many wills and a great many of the disputes that follow them. I have never read a document that anticipated its own contestation with this degree of precision. She looked at Gerald Stowe. Counselor, your clients have not only lost this motion, they have, by filing it, activated a provision that removes them permanently from any benefit of this estate. I want to make certain they understand that before we proceed. Stowe leaned toward Diane, a brief, urgent exchange. Diane's face did not change. Judge Winters continued. The petition for emergency guardianship is denied. All associated motions are dismissed. The petitioners are ordered to pay the full legal costs incurred by Walter and Eleanor Crane in defending this action. She picked up her gavel. I would also note for the record that the evidence presented regarding the financial history of this family suggests that an investigation into elder financial abuse may be warranted. I am referring the matter to the county attorney's office for review. The gavel came down. Court is adjourned. The sound of it was very clean in the stone room. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Dorothy Ashford stood up, and the people from Cedar Falls stood up with her, and the standing was quiet and deliberate, the way people stand when they want to mark something without making theater of it. Walter looked at Eleanor. She was looking at her hands in her lap, and he could see the small movement in her shoulders that meant she was keeping something controlled that wanted not to be controlled, and he reached over and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held it. In the hallway afterward, outside the heavy doors, Patricia Oakes intercepted Marcus Hale before he could reach Walter and Eleanor. Walter watched from 20 feet away, not close enough to hear the words, close enough to read the exchange. Patricia spoke for perhaps 45 seconds. She handed Hale a single sheet of paper, which he read. His expression changed the way expressions change when someone has just been shown a fact that reorganizes their professional situation. He looked at the sheet for a long moment. Then he folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. The article he published 4 days later was not the article he had driven up to Cedar Falls to write. The piece that appeared in the Mountain West Courier began. Silas Aldrich spent 37 years building something in secret in the mountains of Jefferson County, Montana. He did it alone, without recognition, without anyone to tell him whether he was right. He left the whole of it to 2 people he barely knew because he believed they were worth the risk. The court agreed with him last Thursday morning. It was the best thing Marcus Hale had written in a decade, and he knew it when he wrote it, and it had nothing to do with the story he had come looking for. That evening at the cabin, Walter and Eleanor sat by the fire and did not talk for a long time. The rain that had threatened all day had arrived a steady percussion on the metal roof that was somehow companionable rather than oppressive. Eleanor held the photograph of Silas. She looked at it the way she had looked at it many times since Dorothy gave it to her, but differently tonight, with the specific attention of someone who was no longer asking a question, but arriving at an answer. Walter said, "We lost them today, really lost them." "We lost them before today," Eleanor said. "Today we just stopped pretending otherwise." He did not argue with it because it was true, and because the difference between knowing something and accepting it is sometimes a courthouse and a gavel and a judge who reads a dead man's letter aloud in front of everyone. "The question is what we do now," Eleanor said. Walter looked at the fire. "Silas built something for 37 years and then gave it away. He gave it to us because he thought we would know what to do with it." He was quiet for a moment. "I think he was telling us something about what to do with it." "Build something," Eleanor said. "Give it away in the right direction." What they built over the following year with Patricia Oakes and a team of financial advisors in the legal framework that Whitmore had helped establish was called the Silas Aldrich Foundation for Elder Justice. Its purpose was specific legal assistance, transitional housing, and financial counseling for elderly individuals who had been financially exploited by family members or caregivers, the people who needed it most and were least likely to find it on their own. They sold portions of the collection through private sales, working with reputable houses, ensuring that the pieces went to institutions and collectors who would preserve and exhibit them. The Bierstadt went to a museum in Denver that had wanted it for years. The Wyeth series went to a foundation in Pennsylvania that specialized in American realist work. Each sale generated funds, and every dollar went into the foundation's operating budget, and nothing went to Walter and Eleanor Crane beyond what they needed to live in the cabin and continue the work. Walter's contribution to the construction of the foundation's first building was not administrative. He worked alongside the crew that built it, a timber frame structure adjacent to the cabin that honored the forest it stood in and provided space for counseling, legal consultations, and support groups. His hands still carried the tremor from 3 years back. It did not prevent him from measuring or cutting or fitting a door frame until the gap was right. Some things you do not lose, even when they are impaired. The knowledge of how things should fit together is one of them. Dorothy became the foundation's historian, documenting the stories of the people who came through it, building an archive that could be used for advocacy and education. Sheriff Holbrook joined the advisory board. The Cedar Falls community provided volunteers, and the foundation provided something the community had not known it was missing until it existed, a reason for people to believe that a small town in the mountains could matter to the larger world in a specific and useful way. 6 months after the foundation opened, a woman named Helen Marsh arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in April. She was 74 years old, and she was carrying 2 trash bags that held everything she owned, and she had driven from Spokane on the strength of an article she had read in a regional paper about what was happening in Jefferson County, Montana. Her daughter had obtained power of attorney 2 years earlier, she said, had sold her mother's house, had kept the proceeds, and told her mother the money had been used for her care. When Helen had tried to find legal help, she had found forms and wait lists and people who were sympathetic but overwhelmed, which is the ordinary experience of people who have been wronged in ways that are not dramatic enough to attract attention. Walter was on the roof of the second cabin unit when Eleanor called up to him that there was someone who needed them. He climbed down and walked across the yard and found Helen Marsh standing in the entrance of the foundation building with her 2 bags, and he took the bags from her hands without saying anything and carried them inside. It was a small gesture. He would not have been able to explain exactly why he made it, but Eleanor, watching from the doorway, understood it completely. It was the gesture of a man who had been carrying things alone for a very long time and had finally understood that the correct response to someone else's weight was not to advise them about it, but to help them carry it. 1 year after that, Helen Marsh was volunteering at the foundation 3 days a week. She worked with women who had just arrived, the ones still carrying bags, the ones who had not yet been able to describe what had happened to them in the flat language of facts rather than the churning language of shame. She knew how to sit with them in the way that was useful, not with comfort exactly, but with the specific companionship of someone who had been in the same place and had found the way through. Walter watched her one afternoon from across the room and said to Eleanor quietly, "That's what Silas was doing. He saw something in someone and he made room for it." Eleanor thought about that. He saw it and then he built something that would allow it to exist. "That's what we're doing," Yes, she said, I think it is. Carol called in the second month after the hearing, not about the estate, not about the foundation or the will or any of the legal proceedings. She called at 7 in the evening on a Wednesday, and when Eleanor answered, she said, I've been trying to figure out how to make this call for 6 weeks. She said she had known standing in the yard of the cabin that afternoon with Diane and Brett and Gerald Stowe that she was in the wrong place making the wrong choice. She said she had not had the courage to leave. She said she was not asking for anything except for Eleanor to know that at least one of her children had understood eventually what they had done. Eleanor sat with the phone for a long moment after Carol finished. You're right that you should have left, she said, but you called. That's not nothing. She paused. We'll see, Carol. Not today, but we'll see. When she told Walter, he listened and did not say anything for a while. Then he said, Owen said he was sorry with a phone call. Carol said it. We'll see which ones mean it by what they do next. Silas gave us the benefit of the doubt, Eleanor said. Silas watched us for 20 years first. Fair point. Owen came in the autumn of the second year driving a truck that was several years older than the one he had owned before. He was thinner and his haircut was practical, and he carried a toolbox in his hand not as a symbol, but as an object. He had spent 8 months learning to weld, he said. He heard they were building. Walter looked at the toolbox. He looked at his son. Do you know how to read a level? I know the concept. Knowing the concept and reading one are different things. I know that too. 6 in the morning. Do not be late. Owen was not late. He made mistakes. The ordinary mistakes of someone learning a physical skill, and Walter corrected them the way he had been corrected himself 40 years ago, without patience for sloppiness, but without cruelty, either because the point was not to make a man feel small, but to make the work right. Within 3 months, Owen could frame a wall. Within 6, he was reliable enough that Walter would leave a section to him and come back to find it done correctly. Neither of them spoke much about what had happened. The work spoke instead, which was the language they had always shared and which had survived everything else. 5 years after the courthouse. October, the aspens on the property full gold, the mountains behind them sharp and clear in the autumn air. The Silas Aldrich Memorial Garden was dedicated on a Saturday with 312 people present, more than the entire population of Cedar Falls, which meant that people had driven significant distances to be there. The stone monument at the garden's center bore the line from Silas's letter, "In a world of takers, remain givers." Dorothy gave a short speech about who Silas had been, the careful private man who had attended every auction alone and driven home alone and sat in a chair at the edge of family gatherings and watched. She said what she had come to understand about him over 40 years, that his solitude had not been emptiness, but discipline, the discipline of someone who had decided what was worth building and had built it without distraction. Sheriff Holbrook stood at the back in his uniform and said nothing, which was the most appropriate thing he could have done and which he understood perfectly. Eleanor spoke last. She did not give a long speech. She was not a woman who believed that length indicated importance. Silas Aldrich trusted 2 people he barely knew with everything he spent his life building, she said. He didn't know what we would do with it. He only knew what we were. We have spent 5 years trying to be worthy of that judgment. I think we have some way still to go, but I think we are on the right road. She stepped back. Walter was standing beside her, and she felt his hand find hers without looking, the same gesture he had made in the courtroom, the same gesture he had been making for 52 years in different circumstances, the same hand steadier now than it had been in a long time. That evening, after the last visitors had gone and the lights in the foundation building had been turned off, Walter and Eleanor sat on the porch of the cabin. The photograph of Silas was on the table between them, which was where it usually was in the evenings now. Walter picked it up. He looked at the face of the man who had sat at the edge of a yard in Oregon in 1987 and made a decision that had changed everything. The peaceful eyes, the contained expression, the look of a man who was exactly where he had chosen to be. Do you think he was lonely? Walter said. It was the question Eleanor had asked Dorothy in the library 2 years ago and which Dorothy had answered carefully and incompletely. Eleanor considered it honestly. I think he made a trade. He traded company for purpose. And I think most days he believed it was the right trade. She paused. I think some days he wasn't sure. That sounds about right for any decision worth making. Yes, it does. Below them, the foundation campus was quiet in the evening light. 3 buildings now, 20 small homes, a community garden that Owen had designed and planted in the spring, a medical clinic that a retired doctor from Billings had staffed 2 days a week since the previous winter. The vault beneath the cabin floor was empty. Now all of it distributed, all of it in motion, all of it doing what Silas had quietly, patiently, over 37 years of solitude in the Montana mountains, intended it to do. Walter set the photograph down. He looked at his hands. The tremor was still there, the permanent souvenir of a Tuesday morning in March, 3 years before everything changed. But the hands that had built portions of this place, that had carried Helen Marsh's bags, that had taught Owen to read a level, that had held Eleanor's hand in a courthouse, while a dead man's words dismantled his children's claims, those hands had not been diminished by what they could no longer do perfectly. They had found other things to do, and they had done them. He sat in that yard, Walter said, and he saw two people he had met twice, and he decided they were worth everything he had spent 30 years building. Yes, that's a significant bet on strangers. We weren't strangers to him. He had been watching us for years. We were strangers to ourselves, maybe. We didn't know anyone was keeping track. Eleanor picked up the photograph one more time, looked at it, and set it down with the quiet finality of someone completing a long conversation. He knew. That's what he was doing up here. Not hiding, keeping track. The light was failing over the mountains, the sky moving through its evening sequence of amber and rose and deep blue, and the pines on the slopes held their color as the light changed around them, dark and permanent and rooted. Somewhere in the trees, the owl that lived on the eastern ridge called out once, just once. The sound traveled through the stillness and faded. Walter Crane, 78 years old, sat on the porch of a cabin he had not built, but had come to belong to, beside the woman he had sat beside on a cold concrete garage floor 20 years ago, when he did not know who he was anymore, and he understood something that he had not had the words for until this moment. The value of a life is not in what it accumulates. It is not even entirely in what it gives away. It is in the quality of attention it brings to the people around it, the willingness to look carefully and see truly, and then act on what you see, even if acting means sitting alone in a chair at the edge of things for 37 years, and watching and waiting and building quietly until the moment arrives. Silas Aldrich had seen two people clearly, and that clear seeing, that refusal to look away from what was actually there, had been worth more than anything in the vault beneath the floor. Walter Crane took his wife's hand. The pines held still against the darkening sky. The lights in the small homes below them came on one by one, and each one was a person who had been left with nothing and had found their way here and was warm,